Have you ever missed someone who was slowly destroying you? Not because they loved you too little, but because they knew exactly how to love you, just enough to keep you there. That is what makes toxic relationships so psychologically disturbing. They do not always begin with pain. They often begin with relief, with attention, with the eerie feeling that someone finally sees the parts of you that the rest of the world ignored. And that is why people stay longer than they should. Not because they are weak, not because they are blind, but because toxic love does not feel toxic in the beginning. It feels like destiny. It feels like intensity. It feels like finally being chosen. By the time the damage becomes obvious, the attachment is already deep. The confusion is already wired into the nervous system, and leaving no longer feels like freedom. It feels like withdrawal. That is the hidden psychology of toxic relationships. The fact that the same person who hurts you can become the person your mind believes it needs to survive. Most people imagine toxic relationships as obvious chaos. Constant screaming, betrayal, cruel words, open disrespect. But some of the most damaging relationships do not look dramatic from the outside. They look passionate, private, complicated. People say things like, they just love each other too much. But what they are really seeing is a nervous system trapped in a cycle of craving and fear. Because toxicity is not defined by how loud a relationship is. It is defined by what it does to your inner world. Does it make you doubt your memory? Does it make you monitor your words like you are walking through a minefield? Does it turn love into a performance where safety depends on saying the right thing at the right time in the right tone? That is not connection. That is conditioning. One woman described her relationship in a way that said everything. She said, "I was never sure which version of him was coming home. Some nights he was warm, attentive, affectionate. He remembered details. He held her like she mattered. Other nights he was cold in a way that made the room feel smaller. He would withdraw for hours, then punish her for asking what was wrong." Over time, she became hyper-aware of everything. His footsteps, his silence, his breathing. She stopped asking for too much. Then she stopped asking for anything. The tragedy was not only that he changed. The tragedy was that she changed first. She called it love. Her body called it danger. This is where deep psychology begins. Human beings do not bond only through pleasure. We also bond through unpredictability. In fact, intermittent reward can be more addictive than consistent reward. When affection comes in fragments, the mind clings harder. It starts chasing the next moment of relief. This is the same psychological mechanism that keeps gamblers at slot machines. The uncertainty itself becomes gripping. Not knowing when the next good moment will come creates obsession. In toxic relationships, love is scattered between neglect, criticism, distance, blame, and sudden tenderness. That tenderness feels powerful not because it is healthy, but because it interrupts pain. The brain mistakes relief for love. That is why people often say, "But when it was good, it was so good." And they mean it. The highs were real. The warmth was real. The chemistry was real. But chemistry is not always compatibility. Intensity is not always intimacy. Sometimes what feels electric is simply your trauma meeting someone else's instability. Sometimes the spark is your nervous system recognizing a familiar kind of danger and mistaking it for passion. A man once said he could not understand why he kept going back to a woman who humiliated him. She mocked his insecurities, disappeared for days, then returned with overwhelming affection. He was educated, self-aware, successful. He felt ashamed that he could not walk away. But his story had roots deeper than the relationship itself. As a child, praise in his home was unpredictable. Love came when he performed well, stayed quiet, and made himself useful. So when he met someone whose affection had to be earned, chased, and carefully protected, it did not feel foreign. It felt like home. Painfully familiar patterns often feel safer than unfamiliar peace. This is one of the darkest truths about toxic relationships. People do not only choose partners, they often repeat emotional environments. The psyche is drawn to what it already knows, even when what it knows is harmful. If you grew up around criticism, emotional inconsistency, manipulation, or abandonment, your brain may not instantly trust calm, healthy love. Healthy love can feel boring at first, suspicious, even empty, not because it lacks depth, but because it lacks the chaos you were trained to associate with attachment. Toxic relationships thrive in that confusion. They turn survival patterns into romantic rituals. Then there is gaslighting, one of the most psychologically corrosive forms of control. Gaslighting is not just lying. It is the systematic erosion of another person's confidence in their own perception. It is being told that never happened, you are too sensitive, you are imagining things, you always twist everything. At first, it sounds like ordinary conflict, but over time, the victim stops trusting their own memory, their own emotional reactions, their own sanity. They begin to rely more and more on the very person distorting reality. That dependence is not accidental. It is the point. A young woman once kept notes on her phone after every argument because she no longer trusted herself. Her partner would say something cruel, then later deny it. He would flirt openly, then accuse her of being paranoid. He would break promises, then make her feel irrational for remembering them. She started writing things down just to prove to herself that she was not losing her mind. Read that again. She was not collecting evidence for a court. She was collecting evidence for her own consciousness. That is what psychological control can do. It makes your inner world feel like a place you cannot safely live in. And yet toxic relationships are not sustained by cruelty alone. They are sustained by meaning. People stay because they build stories around the suffering. Maybe he is wounded. Maybe she is scared. Maybe if I love them better, they will finally feel safe. Maybe this is just a difficult season. Maybe I am the only person who truly understands them. On the surface, these sound compassionate. Sometimes they are. But in toxic relationships, empathy can become a trap. You stop evaluating the impact of someone's behavior because you become fixated on explaining its origin. Their pain becomes more important than your damage. This is especially dangerous for people who learned early in life that love means emotional labor. They become experts at reading moods, soothing tension, and shrinking their own needs. They do not enter relationships asking, "Does this person treat me well?" They enter asking, "How do I become easier to love?" That question quietly destroys people. Because once your worth becomes tied to how much pain you can absorb, boundaries start to feel selfish. Rest feels selfish. Speaking up feels selfish. Even leaving can feel like betrayal. Toxic relationships also distort time. They keep people psychologically stuck between memory and fantasy. Memory says, remember the beginning, remember the tenderness, remember the promises. Fantasy says, one day it will go back to that. One day they will become who they almost are. So you do not relate to the person in front of you. You relate to their potential, to their wounded child, to their rare moments of softness, to the future version of them that exists mostly in your hope. But hope can be dangerous when it keeps you loyal to a version of someone that reality keeps refusing to confirm. One anonymous therapist described a client who stayed with a manipulative partner for 7 years. When asked why, the client did not talk about love first. She talked about investment, the years they shared, The fights she survived, the effort she poured in, the image of the future she had built in her head. This is another hidden force in toxic bonds, the sunk cost effect. The more you give, the harder it becomes to leave, because leaving feels like admitting that your suffering did not lead anywhere. So the mind keeps bargaining. One more chance, one more conversation, one more apology, one more collapse, followed by one more reunion. Not because it is working, but because the alternative feels unbearable. Then there is shame. Shame keeps toxic relationships alive in silence. People are often embarrassed to admit they are being manipulated, especially when they see themselves as intelligent, strong, or emotionally mature. They think, I should have known better. I should have left earlier. But toxic dynamics do not only trap the naive. They trap the lonely, the hopeful, the loyal, the self-doubting, the trauma-bonded, the deeply empathetic. In other words, they trap humans. Shame whispers that your pain is proof of your stupidity. But often it is proof of how badly you wanted love to be real. And perhaps the most confusing part is that toxic people are not always monsters in every moment. Some are charming, insightful, funny, generous in bursts. They may carry real trauma, real insecurity, real wounds. But pain does not excuse harm. A broken past can explain destructive behavior. It cannot justify your destruction. One of the hardest psychological lessons in adult life is realizing that you can